You're watching Good Morning Britain. So we've all seen, haven't we, the protesters causing chaos for tens of thousands of drivers on the M25, now facing jail if they continue to block the motorway. So it's after ministers won an injunction yesterday banning members of the Insulate Britain group from demonstrating on the motorway.
Well, on yesterday's programme, Insulate Britain activist Liam Norton compared public support for his group's campaign to the support shown to Winston Churchill before the outbreak of World War II.
Do you know how many MPs supported Churchill
in
1937?
I'm not interested in Churchill.
6 MPs.
I'm interested in people who can't get to hospital because of what you're doing.
And Churchill was right, wasn't he? We are demanding that the government make a meaningful statement to save the future of this country. And if they refuse to do it, then they can put us in prison. And that's the Home Secretary's decision. And I've had enough of talking to people in this country about what we're doing.
You're doing appears.
This is the state of things.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
So, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen watching this programme, we now know that these protesters are actually following in the footsteps of Winston Churchill.
Well, are they? Are the M25 protesters showing Churchillian spirit? Joining us now is environmental campaigner and writer George Monbiot, who says they're showing courage just like Churchill, alongside Lincolnshire's Police and Crime Commissioner Marc, who says their acts cannot be justified and they are not heroes. So, George, the point I think he was trying to make yesterday was that governments don't always have a priority on vision for the future. MPs didn't support Churchill. Churchill turned out to be right, and they are acting in that way. Do you see the comparison?
Yeah, it's a pretty consistent theme in history. The suffragettes were told they were absolutely outrageous and this was disgraceful what they were doing. They were completely wrong. Gandhi was told the same, the civil rights movement was told the same, and we now look back on them from the perspective of history and say, well, of course they were right, but that's not how they were perceived at the time. And the same applies to Churchill. You know, he swam against the flow of appeasement, and he was laughed out in a very similar way to the way Liam was laughed out of your programme yesterday. But it turned out he was right. So in that respect, in terms of being vindicated by history, I think people taking direct action to try to wake people up, to try to say, look, this is the greatest catastrophe humanity has ever faced, the collapse of our life support systems, I think they will be vindicated by history.
Marc Jones, let's come to you on this. I think the majority of our viewers, and seemingly the majority of the people that you hear from talking about this round and about are not in agreement with George. Gary's saying Churchillian spirit, no, they're just a bunch of irritating morons. They're dangerous. This is Derek. They're threatening lives. They're just idiots. And that's the concern here, isn't it? Regardless of what their campaign and the themes of their campaign, the actions and what they are doing is causing more of an issue and certainly endangering lives at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, this fundamentally, for me, is not about whether climate change is an issue that needs to be resolved. This is about how people behave as citizens, as part of a wider community. And, you know, nobody as an individual gets to decide which protests should and shouldn't be allowed to disrupt public services, put lives at risk. It's just simply not acceptable to say my cause is more important than somebody else's, therefore my rights trump everybody else's rights. It's just not acceptable.
What they would say is that it's not my cause, it's our cause. That's what they would argue, wouldn't they? And what it's done is it's got them on the map. Often, environmental protesters are criticised for not having a clear message. Theirs is very clear. Insulate every home in Britain. Everybody get insulated. So they would say that there's a greater good out there.
Well, I think everybody that protests would argue exactly the same, that their cause is a just one and therefore whatever they do, the means justified by the ends. And I just, you know, we've got to operate within a structure that keeps communities safe, keeps the protesters safe, emergency services, and keeps our essential services running. You know, there are tens of protests going on outside Parliament every day. If each of those different groups that are passionate about what they're campaigning for took this kind of action, the entire country would grind to a halt. It simply cannot be that we permit one group to do this. It doesn't take away from the fact that their cause that they're talking about is important. Of course it is, but there's a democratic process you can join to actually make a difference, and I would urge them to do that.
George, I think the problem that I have with this is that every environmental campaign and all these actions seem to me to just further take it away from people's sympathy. So, you know, you look at the headlines today, facing apparently a winter of discontent, huge rises in bills, massive problems with supplies, worries about getting even the simplest things treated, and ambulances turning up at your door. And in the midst of this incredible pressure that people are under, they suddenly can't get to work. Their lives could be at risk. And so it takes it away from people feeling like it's their problem. You know what I mean? And it makes it just seem like a bunch of irritating people.
I do know what you mean. But, you know, again, I'd say very similar things were said about the suffragettes and the civil rights movement. There was very little public sympathy for them. In fact, they were extremely unpopular at the time. And it's easy for us to look back with a rosy glow and say, oh, yeah, everyone was obviously in favour of that. They really, really weren't. And the question I'd put to you, Kate, is, well, what would you do? You know, for 36 years now, I've been an environmental campaigner, and I've seen the time just trickling away like it was in an hourglass, just disappearing, the time in which we got to act to prevent the collapse of our life support systems. I mean, we're talking about a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale, the world basically becoming uninhabitable for most human beings. And we've tried everything to cut through the complacency, to get government to act, to get people to sit up, to wake up. And at least now we're talking about it. And we're talking about it because of those tactics of Insulate Britain that you don't like.
They've acted, though, haven't they? They've not acted to support people insulating their homes. They've not acted to make it easier for people to be green. They've acted by having greater powers to prosecute the protesters.
Hey, they've been pursuing these greater powers since 1986. The powers have been shut down to protest all the way. And there's less and less protests that we're allowed to do. And so, you know, for Marc, you know, bless him, because I understand his position, but to turn around and say, well, you should just protest legally, they've banned almost all the effective forms of protest since I've been active. You know, since 1986, the Public Order Act then, one act after another. Yeah. Now we've got the police bill going through Parliament saying you can basically shut down any protest which causes serious unease to someone. I cause serious unease to people just by existing.
George, Marc, let's just come to you on that point, because as you mentioned to Kate just a moment ago, there are tens of groups outside Parliament that are protesting every day. They are equally passionate and believe in the cause that they're protesting about. But we don't know what those groups are individually. And the reality is Insulate Britain have got their message out. They've got their story out. We're still talking about it today. And it's a pretty simple goal that they're trying to get the government to address. And if that's the point of raising this issue and getting people talking about it and what it is, then it's been pretty successful, regardless of how we feel about their motives and what they're doing to make it work.
Well, I would arguably say if you ask people that couldn't get to hospital because of their actions, if you ask people that couldn't get to work, children couldn't get to school, ask them whether it was successful, and I think you'd get a different story. I think, you know, you can judge success by a publicity stunt and say, well, we got on the news. Well, OK, you've been successful in that. Has it actually resolved the issue? And the honest truth is no. The way to engage with this is through the democratic process. The suffragette movement, you know, that was about 50% of adult communities not being able to have the vote. Well, we're not in that position. We can all go and vote. We can all stand for election, do this properly, take part in our society, don't try and subvert it.
Well, it's a fascinating...
hang on here, Marc. We've got governments... We've got governments around the world just not taking action. And we're talking about 100% of us facing disaster if action isn't taken, and governments are just sitting on their hands, not doing anything to save us from catastrophe.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. We do appreciate both of you joining us this morning. Lots of people getting in touch. None of our viewers so far supporting the actions of Insulate Britain. Lots of people saying they're nothing like Churchill at all. That's Kev, that's Christopher, David. I think everyone knows that climate change was known for decades. It's nothing like Churchill taking us into World War II at all. Very few in support of their actions. And actually the consequence of their actions and what we know, as Marc was saying there, that the gentleman who took his mother, who was having a stroke, to hospital and sort of slowly watched her struggle further and further because he couldn't get to the hospital is a sort of a compelling case as to why it's been...
Although other people would argue that it's as big as going into World War II, and we could go on, and I'm sure we will. Look, still to come this morning, ahead of his announcement of a raft of new green measures to help make London a zero-carbon city by 2030. Mayor Sadiq Khan will explain why he's asking Londoners for their help, and I'm sure we'll have a view on those protests too. We're going to be speaking to him in a moment next.
You're watching Good Morning Britain on ITV.